Hi everyone, how are you? Welcome to week 3 of distance learning. This week we are going to be covering the end of the 1980s and then the very beginning of the 1990s. There are only 2 videos and 2 assignments because it's a little bit of a shorter week with Monday off. So we are going to dive right in. This video is going to cover the end of the 1980s. So I'm going to share my screen with you all. And minimize myself. All right. We are going to start by talking about the First Intifada. So if you'll remember, we ended our conversation last week with June 1987. We were in Germany with Reagan urging Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, to tear down the Berlin Wall. So we are going to move forward a little bit. We're now going to be in December of 1987, and we are going to focus our attention to the Middle East. In the Middle East, starting in December of 1987, we see the First Intifada begin. This was a Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation of both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It lasts from December of 1987 up through September of 1993. It lasts for quite a long time and only ends when a peace agreement known as the Oslo Accords, which we'll talk about in the 1990s, were signed. They inspired a huge push for a two-state solution, which is one possible solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that calls for 2 separate states, one state of Palestine and one state of Israel. Then in May of 1988, we see, sorry about that, everyone. My daughter just came downstairs. In May of 1988, we see Soviet troops begin their withdrawal from Afghanistan. Remember, they had gone there in the very end of the 1970s and in 1980, had moved into Afghanistan. And so after 9 years, they began to withdraw. While the United States had been supporting the forces in Afghanistan, known as the Mujahideen, against the USSR. The USSR, when they finally decided to withdraw from Afghanistan, they left a power vacuum. They left no one strong in power. And a group that we all know of well today, the Taliban, emerged to fill that space. So it is at the very end of the 1980s that we see the Taliban start to emerge and establish control over parts of Afghanistan. Then in December of 1988, in Scotland, a terrorist's bomb brought down Pan Am Flight 103, killing everyone aboard the flight, which included many college students on their way home to the United States for their Christmas vacation. It's also known as the Lockerbie bombing. It killed, like I said, everyone on board. That was 243 passengers and 16 crew members. It's known as the Lockerbie bombing because it crashed in Lockerbie on a residential street. It killed also 11 people on the ground. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in the United Kingdom, with 270 people killed during the attack. Then in August of 1988, we also saw the end to the Iran-Iraq war. It finally came to an end after 8 years, and more than 1 million people having been killed. We talked about this at the start of the war, earlier in the 1980s, alongside, if you follow my mouse here, alongside the border of Iran and Iraq. Neither side really makes too much progress. Iraq makes a bit of progress at the very beginning. Iran pushes them back, and they basically return to this standstill for approximately 8 years until the United Nations brokers a ceasefire known as Resolution 598 to end the war. On March 24th, 1989, a massive oil spill occurred. So on March 24th in Prince William Sound, Alaska, which you can see here along the southern coast of Alaska, we see the second largest oil spill in US waters occur. At the time, it was the largest oil spill. And this was after an Exxon Valdez tanker, an oil tanker, ran ashore. So it got too close, ran ashore, and oil spilled from that oil tanker. The remote location, being along the southern coast of Alaska, made cleanup very difficult. All in all, it affected about 1,300 miles of coastline, devastating that entire coastline area with oil pollution. Then in April of that same year, hundreds of Chinese students were killed after beginning a protest known as the Tiananmen Square protests in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. They were protesting for more freedoms. They were protesting for the government to listen to them and allow them to have more freedoms. The authorities, the Chinese authorities, declared martial law after these people gathered to protest and sent in about 300,000 troops. This protest and the standoffs lasted from April 15th until June 4th, 1989. On June 4th, the tanks and the military that were in Beijing overran Tiananmen Square, killing hundreds of Chinese students in the process. This man here is known as Tank Man. He is given that name because we do not know his actual identity. It appears, people believe, that he was walking home carrying clearly a bag of groceries here, perhaps, carrying something, and caused all of these tanks to stop in front of him. He is considered a symbol of democracy and of freedom for standing up to a militarized government working against its people. The assignment that you're going to work on for the end of the 1980s does focus on the Tiananmen Square massacre, and so you'll read more about Tank Man and about the process by which this group of people came to protest and how the Chinese government shut them down. Then in August of 1989, F.W. de Klerk was elected president of South Africa. So in 1989, white South Africans, black South Africans still did not have the right to vote. They elected F.W. de Klerk, whose main goal, and he was outspoken about this, was to transform South Africa and to end its isolation. He ended up working to open up the government and began the process to end apartheid by legalizing the African National Congress, which was that political group that we have discussed in South Africa supporting Black South Africans' rights. Then on November 9th, 1989, people began to take apart the Berlin Wall. Quote here from Hope Harrison, who's a professor of history and international affairs at GW, and it says, or Hope Harrison says, the wall symbolized the lack of freedom under communism. It symbolized the Cold War and divide between the communist Soviet bloc and the Western democratic capitalist bloc. Berlin was on the front line in the Cold War struggle between the superpowers. The demolition officially began about 6 months later in June of 1990 and was completed 2 years after people first began to take the wall apart in November of 1991. And the coming down of the Berlin Wall paved the way for German reunification. And finally, last but not least, in the very end of the 1980s, we see the US invasion of Panama. Codenamed Operation Just Cause, this occurred between mid-December of 1989 and late January of 1990. So it lasted only about a month and a half, and its purpose was to remove the current dictator Manuel Noriega, from power and to finally bring democracy to Panama. And it worked. Noriega was deposed, he was removed from power, and President Endara was sworn into office. George H.W. Bush, President of the United States at the time, gave 4 main reasons for the invasion, for why he decided that the United States needed to invade. The first reason was to keep safe the 35,000 or so US citizens in Panama at the time. The second reason was to defend democracy and human rights in Panama. The third reason was to combat drug trafficking coming either from or often through Panama. And 4, to protect the integrity of the treaties that had been signed in 1979 by President Jimmy Carter to eventually transfer control of the Panama Canal. You may remember we talked about how they decided that the Panama Canal would be taken under the control of the Panamanians, with that to occur officially in December of 1999. That process, however, was started in 1979, and H.W. Bush wanted to make sure that the integrity of those treaties would stay intact. And so for those 4 reasons, the United States led an invasion into Panama and helped to establish democracy in Panama with the removal of dictator Noriega from power. As I said, your work along with this video is a reading and questions on the Tiananmen Square massacre. And as always, let me know if you have any questions.